Good afternoon to everyone. As Mona said, we're at capacity, so we might as well start even a minute early, which is unusual for a lab talk. But we've got the room full, and thank you all for coming. I'm here to basically represent the procurer, or not exactly procurer, since Vic said he wanted to give the talk, and I had to find a way to fit it in someplace in the schedule. But so I thought I'd say a couple of things about where the talk came from, and then Mona will give as close as you can give to a professional, careful introduction to Vic. But I wanted to say a couple of things first. One, the way the talk came about, Vic was asked by a group at Caltech to give a talk, and he gave a talk something like the one you're going to hear, which covered everything in the world and tried to hook it up. He said it was well received at Caltech, but since they offered food and drink, he wasn't sure if that was the attraction or he was the attraction. So we've at least filled the room without the food and drink. The second thing is a thing which Vic doesn't know, because I actually went through each of the pieces in the talk, and the lab actually contributed singular things to maybe 7 or 8 pieces along that journey, which I will somehow educate him on eventually, because they were really kind of significant things, like the nuclear winter piece. We really did real stuff, real pieces. And the third reason I'm up here is to strongly encourage you to come to the Foster Medal event tomorrow afternoon, which Vic will be receiving. But I think you'll hear interesting talks, interesting stuff, and so I very much encourage you to come to that event. With that, Mona will come up and give a proper introduction for our speaker this afternoon.
Okay, thanks. Can everybody hear? Yeah, it's okay. All right, well, welcome. Thank you for coming to the Center for Global Security Research here at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And I feel bad that we have an overflow crowd and we can't let everybody in, but we are videotaping this event, and we hope we'll have that on the web sometime in the near future. And just to do due diligence and remind you, in the event of an emergency, you need to go out to the doors over here to my, this is left, go out the door and come back, go outside to the doors in the front of the building, the ones you probably came into, and we'll direct you to the right assembly point. So my name is Mona Dreiser. I'm the Deputy Director here at CGSR, and it's my pleasure to introduce a former US government official, as it says in your bio, who is best known as the architect and original sponsor for the US Nuclear Stockpile Stewardship Program. This happened during his term as Assistant Secretary for Defense Programs in the Department of Energy from 1993 to 1999. Now, here at our lab and other national security laboratories and through the complex, Vic Reese doesn't really need an introduction, but as has been said, I need to do a formal one. And so I just want to say in an abbreviated way that he, besides serving at DOE, was the Assistant Director for National Security and Space in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP, Vice President at SAIC, Director of DARPA, and Director of Defense Research and Engineering at DoD. And until recently, he served as Senior Advisor for the Secretary of Energy, the Office of the Secretary of Energy, and participates on many different advisory boards. And as Bruce said, he's here to accept an award tomorrow, and we really are very fortunate in order to have you be willing to do a presentation here for us as a CGSR seminar. Today we'll hear his ideas that connect between nuclear deterrence and climate change mitigation, as inspired by a January 2017 article in the New Yorker magazine. And that article addressed the difficulties in setting national security strategies when using results that are uncertain because they've been produced by modeling real-world events, but they're models. And so please welcome Vic Reese, who will tell us the story of politics, people, science, economics, theology, models, and imagination. Thank you.
Okay, so this was, as Bruce said, this is a talk I gave at Caltech to a group of students there. And I first said, they first wanted me to talk about stockpile stewardship. I said, well, you know, Hanrahan went there and gave that. I'd like to talk about the connection between nuclear weapons and climate change. And they said, gee, that's hard. I said, yes, that's why, you know, give a talk. And then while I got started, and of course, many of you will recognize this talk because I've given it here, I think, for 30 years. Every 10 years I come and essentially give the same talk the cast of characters just changes a little bit. So this was, but I like to start these really with Eisenhower. Okay, and when the Atoms for Peace speech he gave in December in 1953, this was 5 years before there was any nuclear power, or the Russians had just a few years earlier had gotten off with a thermonuclear bomb and so forth, and we were just beginning of the race, the arms race, and I think we had maybe 500 nuclear weapons. The Russians might have had, Soviets might have had 5 or something like that. Eisenhower went and said, we got to think through this whole thing and think about this. And he said, let's help solve the fearful atomic dilemma. And that's essentially what we've been doing. I gave a little talk like this, or a discussion at CSIS last fall, and Larry Welch, you'll see tomorrow, said, Vic, what problem are you trying to solve? And I realized that what we're trying to do is the atomic dilemma. I don't think we can solve it, but I think we can manage it. I gave this talk, and at the time I said, well, you'll notice the picture, they got like all pictures, right? They go to the web or something and try to find a high definition picture. This was some years ago, so I think this one is a little more like it. That was a year, basically a year ago. And I'm not making a speech, it really is a seminar in terms of talk, basically talking. And I'm giving essentially the same talk, except that I picked off where I remembered or thought about where Livermore basically played a role in this. Now, and I said, look, these are Caltech students. You give a talk, you concentrate on things, and then questions come from all over. What I'd like to do is sort of preempt a little bit and say, these are the type of questions that I would expect that one to get. Hey, is zero nuclear weapon regime useful? Nuclear power necessary to do climate change? Can you indeed enforce any kind of international arrangements? And then really, what's the role of the United States? As you remember, what Eisenhower did is said, hey, these are going to be awful problems, but the United States is going to lead. That was our role. And in fact, he was right about it. Now, and then I'm going to say, what I'm going to try to look at is, can you analyze this and look at the whole thing as a global system? When I gave this talk 20 years ago, or maybe it was 15 years ago, Fred Ickley, who some of you may remember, was in the room. And he said, Vic, you've got a Gesamtkonzept. I didn't know what that was. I looked it up. And it really means trying to look, it's a German phrase, means you're trying to look at the whole problem, basically the whole problem together. And as I go through this, I'm going to try to understand what's the role of modeling. Because that seems to come up frequently, and then how important is science in terms of what you're doing. So since I've been trying to do this for 10 years, along comes this paper in the New Yorker, January 31st. Has anybody read it? Okay, 4%. Well, that's not bad. And it's by by Jill Lepore, who, in addition to being a staff writer for the New Yorker, she's a professor, endowed professor of history at Harvard. Okay, so, well, this should have been. And her title of it was The Atomic Origins of Climate Science: How Arguments About Nuclear Weapons Shape the Debate Over Global Warming. So I read all this article, slightly overwritten, but nonetheless, there's all our friends, Bill Perry and Carl Sagan and all these folks, and she ends up with this. And you can read it, but she said, in the short term, the idea of nuclear winter defeated the idea of deterrence. And in the long term, Sagan, that's Carl Sagan, haste and exuberance undermined environmental science. Now, both of those are completely wrong. Okay, and I'll show you what she said, and we can talk about why it's wrong, and then I'll try to tell you what I think is right. Basically is the right. So, but, you know, this is the New Yorker. This is a professor at Harvard, and, you know, it's one of the kind of interesting things where every fact is correct, but the story that gets put together is completely false, almost completely false. So I thought we'd go through this. So this is, first of all, she said that Carl Sagan's faulty nuclear winter model convinced President Reagan that nuclear deterrence was faulty. That's his model, okay. What is nuclear winter? Right, well, it turns out nuclear winter says in a massive exchange, if you look carefully here, you can't quite say it, why maybe 5,000 megatons exchange, what happens is lots of places, there's lots of burning that takes place. The burning that goes up into the stratosphere, it stays there for soot and so forth, stays there a long enough time. My God, the whole thing gets really very, very cold for long periods of time, and not just, not just human beings, but much of other life is essentially destroyed as well. Carl Sagan, does anybody remember? Yeah, so he was a very popular, actually very, not a bad scientist, extremely good at popularizing sort of things. Sort of very early and very popular. In fact, there's a book he wrote about. And there's Ronald Reagan. Okay, you may remember this, I do. I was working at OSTP at the time, March 23rd, where he said he calls upon the scientific community in our country, those of us who gave nuclear weapons, to turn their talents on mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. So that was Star Wars, Strategic Defense Initiative. Okay, now how many of you worked on something called the Strategic Defense Initiative? A lot more than read the book, right? Well, actually, I was there at OSTP, and one of my jobs was to attend all the national security staff meetings. There was never any mention of nuclear winter in any of these things. So I can't say it didn't happen, but in fact, it didn't seem to be, it was an assumption that didn't seem to be true. But she talks quite a bit about going to zero nuclear weapons. Gorbachev and Reagan, talking in Reykjavik. It was Star Wars. They were just about to make a deal, you remember, and Reagan said, well, I'd like to continue working with SDI, and that there was no deal. Okay. However, that was, more recently, Schultz, Perry, Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, Global Zero, right? Any of you members of Global Zero? Okay, you don't have to, okay. Saying, hey, we really should go to zero. We should go to zero. In fact, it got so far as in President Obama's Prague speech, he mentioned the United States will take concrete steps toward a world without nuclear weapons. Didn't say when exactly. And there was Perry, Nunn, Schultz, Kissinger, with Obama, congratulating him. So that did get it basically some years later after 1990, did get into our national aspirational, at least, aspirational. You were in charge of this, weren't you, at the time? Okay, so now the other part, so we did move, and the other part was, did faulty nuclear weapon model provide an argument for climate deniers and skeptics, right? There, again, was the modeling. The one in the red, I didn't want to confuse it. The people looked at this about some years later. This was about 2003. They put the analysis together, and it didn't hold true. There was some change, even for relatively large exchange. And it's still a topic of some discussion. But what she says, hey, Fred Singer was sort of key guy showing up at all of these meetings. This and then there was this. There's still some data floating around in terms of that. From Christie at University of Alabama at Huntsville is still saying, hey, this still doesn't work. Maybe we can talk later about, we're going to take a vote, right? But there's more to it than that. There's Ben Santer, right, who was right involved, okay, in whose job, last time I talked to him, which was some years ago, was, wait a minute, let me look at all of these models and try to develop whether they were valid or not. We'll be chatting with him tomorrow. I assume he's still on board on this, but there's still some members of the scientific community who is still in terms of the skeptics. Will Haffer, who is at Princeton, was the assistant secretary for now called the Office of Science. Freeman Dyson, right, are still there. And this is interesting one. Steve Koonin, right, who was a Caltech professor, provost, chief scientist at British Petroleum. He was the deputy undersecretary for science. I sort of worked for Steve. Steve was involved with stockpile stewardship early. And he's now, of course, on your board of governors. And he's put this together saying, hey, gee, there's still some controversy on this. Why don't we have a red team and a blue team who will then go after it all? So later on in the discussion period, maybe we can talk a little bit about whether red teams and blue teams are useful for scientific areas in any event. So here's another backstory. There's always some sort of backstory that people don't quite know about. That's what, if you will, Professor Lepore was trying to do. So this is mine. This starts off with someone you might know, Edward Teller, and the X-ray laser. Anybody here actually work on the X-ray laser? So there were a few people up. Okay, it was a big deal here, right? We were all excited about it. Edward Teller actually briefed the Chief of Naval Operation, Admiral Watkins. Now, at the time at OSTP, we were doing a big analysis of, is there anything new in BMD? In fact, that's why Keyworth hired me to do that. We had just pretty much finished it. Many of your friends were participating one way or another on that. Well, Edward got in to brief Watkins. There's another story on that. Okay, and that is the Chief of Naval Operations, or the Chief Chaplain of the Navy Services, was Admiral O'Connor. Now, if those of you who are studying facial recognition, you'll recognize the two faces there. That's Admiral O'Connor, and there's Cardinal OConnor. It's the same person. Okay, at the time he was a bishop, but he was indeed, there was the nuclear freeze movement, and then the bishops, the U.S. Council of Bishops, wrote this letter to the president. And sitting at in the NSC staff meetings, that was taken very seriously. People really thought very, very clearly about it. Now this one I'm not sure, but he was talking to Bud McFarland about this, who's a Marine. Okay, I know Bud McFarland actually wrote the president's speech, because by that time I was sort of on the inside group trying to do something else. So there's another story, which is, there's been a lot written about how Star Wars started and whatever. I've subsequently checked this with other, and this one really does hold true. So for those, again, who are in the activist group, say, wait a minute, activists and how they do things actually can basically make a difference in some ways. You never know quite how it's going to be. Speaking of modelings, then, and this is a quote from, nuclear weapons is speculation, and it's doctrinally is something to do in common with belief in hell. Now, how do you model hell? Well, it turns out Dante modeled her. some years ago, right? The 11. All right, so now having done all that, I said, well, wait a minute, and this gets back to, again, what you've heard. So how do you get back, in fact, to then if these facts are correct, but how do you now put together to make the story? How do you connect the two? And that's why I'm saying, hey, what we're trying to do is just sort of reshape and manage Eisenhower's nuclear dilemma. And again, this is a hypothesis, if you will. It's the Gesamt concept. Can you look at the whole thing together? You learn anything by looking at the whole thing together. Well, let's start off with some assumptions. Climate change, global warming is a time-urgent major global threat. It's not just going to happen sometime in the future, but it's time-urgent. A lot of nuclear power can play a major role in climate change mitigation. And that's important. And the ones in red said, I'm going to give you a little more discussion of that. A fixed number of safe and secure nuclear weapons can provide strategic stability between weapon states or deterrence, and we can do that without underground testing. Now, this is where it comes together because the fuel material production processes are similar, in fact, almost the same. Any group with the material can make a nuclear explosive, and that's the dilemma. Eisenhower didn't say that explicitly, but that's the dilemma that you have to work with, and it's a fact. So, strategic stability, climate change mitigation, non-proliferation require verifiable international institutional agreements. If anybody can do it, you have to have some way of agreeing on what needs to be done, and then you have to be able to verify in some way that that's done. Well, that's where treaties come in, right? Kyoto Treaty, the Paris Accord, START between U.S. and Russia, the CTBT, to the UN, the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, UN thing. A number of issues then, the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership that we worked on some years ago, the agreed framework with South Korea and North Korea, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, all of these things are part of that, and the key to making them work is, I think, is nuclear fuel these things. Well, I first ran into this back in the early 2000s with George St. Choi and Tom Isaacs. Now, this is an idea that had been floating around all the way since Oppenheimer and Beta and so forth, but they actually put genuine numbers into it. And then I wrote a paper with them some years later, trying to model what it was to talk about. But that really basically is it. Okay, so the end of the Cold War now, let's get back to the nuclear weapons. What happened to that model? There was a model, right? We used numbers, different types. It's really interesting. If you look back here, and many of you, I think we're probably wrong with this. Let me see if I do this right. Thank you. Okay. Lasers are hard to really. There we go. Just have to have the right figure. So, this is an area, and some of you actually, Bill Dunlap, right? Some of you guys actually worked on this stuff. Right? I mean, back in the early days, all sorts of things were tried. A lot of different nuclear weapons went on, backpacks all the way to, many, many things. Also, it was an area, and a lot of these things got into this system. It was an area of enormous innovation. Things were building up, lots and lots of tests. We could go through that. So that all basically changed with George H.W. Bush first. He said, hey, after the Cold War, the Cold War's kind of over here, right? This is where we're going to reduce the numbers, and we're not going to build any more types. So, then, who was Secretary of Energy at the time? Well, that was now no more Admiral Watkins. This is now Secretary Watkins. And then, of course, no underground tests, right? That's okay. Now, wait a minute. He's not talking about, going to global zero. He's saying that's part of our deterrent posture. We've got to maintain that. We'll explore other means of maintaining our confidence, safety, reliability, performance of all weapons. July 93. I show up in August of 93, and they say, here. No. How do we do this, right? And of course, that became science-based stockpile stewardship. The name stockpile stewardship had been chosen by Congress, and they put in $100 million, some small amount to start to think about it. But what I added was science-based to that. So there it is. This is the way I like to think about these things. There's a vision, there's a strategy, there's some sort of a timely goal. This will now ring a bell with some of you talking about it. So what I did here, it was actually, then I said I want to get the people who are running the weapons laboratory, the weapons programs, and their chief scientists meet with me at the vault in Sandia, Albuquerque, where they couldn't go and enjoy themselves. And we sat there. I said, we're going to just stay here. George Miller, Dick Fortner, John Emily, John Brown, Roger Hagen-Gruber, Jerry Jonas, right? And me. I mean, there was nobody taking notes or whatever. Brown, I saw John maybe a year ago. He says, I remember that meeting. He says, you started off by asking us all how old we were. I didn't remember that. But we did start off by saying, how many weapons do we think we've got to have in the year 2010? What do you think is the stockpile we have to support? And keep it, you didn't have to raise and discuss it. Just put it down on a piece of paper, and the numbers came back all the way from 0, to 5,000. So we said, well, let's take 3,500 plus or minus 1,500, and we began to work with that. And what was the program? Well, what was the strategy behind that? And you start to think about it, it was really validated simulation. Okay, and the idea was you would do validation, big validation experiments, but the lab would have to partner with high performance computing. And of course, each laboratory, well, first thing I started about, each laboratory gets 1/3 of the budget. So you don't have, right, each lab, 1/3. Forget that. Remember, there was all that competition. You get 1/3 of the budget. Let's put that. And then I said, each laboratory gets a big thing to do. Your choice, right? And, not surprisingly, Livermore chose the National Ignition Facility. It was, these other things too. Then we had to put together, and we had to do the supercomputing, right? Each laboratory would then get a large computer, but they would have to work with, the high performance computing industry to make that happen. That's Gil Wygand, who was brought in to do all this. Timely goal, how much would you have to be able to do that? I put together a group, this is Charlie McMillan, he put together a group saying, how much would you actually have to have by this year? 2000. He said, oh, well, they went back and did the numbers, we're going to have the little cracks and things are going to be so size, we're going to have to do 3D, we're going to have to do this and that. So he said, we're going to need about 100 teraflops, which was about a factor of 1 million more than people were working with at the time. He said, well, when do you think we need that? And I said, how about 2004? Because I figured Seymour Sack would probably have retired by then. And that's as far as it went. I mean, there was no deep analysis beyond that. I have to tell the truth. Interestingly enough, I got a handwritten letter from Seymour, now that we're in the privacy of the web. And he gave me a handwritten letter and said, the weapons that I've designed are going to last a lot longer than 10 or 15 years. We don't need an if, and just give us a workstation. We'll be fine. So I figured that's a pretty good start. And then I had to, basically you had to do this was the part, the politics, Hazel, O'Leary, Bill Perry and John, Bill was the Secretary of Defense, John Shalikashvili was the chairman at the time, and I had worked with them. See, the part of that DARPA DDR&E part, it just, even though I didn't know anything about, very much about nuclear weapons, I sure knew the people I was basically dealing with. And the other person at the end of this, who I became very, very friendly with very, very quickly, of course, was Pete Dominici, who had a lot of friends at the time. Harry Reid, John Kyle. I mean, all these guys, they were all a club, basically together. And they looked to Dominici to sort of give them. I will mention one thing is, of course, is that here, Livermore started, worked with IBM on that. And IBM was really having a lot of problems with something called Blue Gene, which was an equivalent massively powered computing. And it was Dave Novak, who was working on the program, who was able to point to them to fix that. That became Watson. Okay, Dave's, passed away, but he was really, while he was hard to understand, he was really kind of a genius in being able to understand how things could basically fit together. Okay, so this is stewardship back, and it said now what it is now. A year or so ago, I had Bruce Held, when he came in to be head of NSA, he said, Vic, why don't you go back and see where we are now? Just give me an independent look, and I had to go to the labs and take it. NIF, MESA, DART, all up and working. Okay, subcritical experiments, which we were doing somewhat, but it took a major role. Since I was talking to Caltech, they had just won the Nobel Prize for this laser interferometer. I pointed out to them that they were doing laser interferometers on the subcritical experiments as well. Here, it was really nice. This is the ASCII picture. I only ask you to go through and to say which one is yours and which one is whatever. But as you can see, the massively parallel processing. I should be able to do this, right? Yeah. That's what we tried to get. We made it, and it really changed the whole face of computing. I'd like to point out that when the Jasons looked at this back in '94, they did a thing. They said this would never. You're going the wrong way. This won't work. So you have to learn when to ignore your advisors. The other thing, and this is, I like to show this. This is a this comes from here somewhere. Someone got this here. What you see here, and we didn't know this at the time, is you see these little. We knew, alphas turn into helium and they will make bubbles, but people didn't know what that would mean. The real thing they were concerned about, and this does happen in steel embrittlement, the bubbles coalesce along a fracture line. So when you squeeze it, things don't come apart. Don't come apart the way you'd like to. Turns out that we sort of bet on the come on that, but we just get bubbles. So it just gets more like a sponge. Still more work to be done on that, but that's basically real good. And I do point out that this is President Oppenheimer said, hey, wait a minute, we're still in the deterrence business. This was as of 1916. Okay, so that's stewardship. And of course, the CTB is yet to be ratified, but the pieces that we said we were going to do, we did. Now, a lot of nuclear power as a solution to climate change mitigation. This is a model that was put together by MIT. When you're at Caltech, you like to show them. They're better. This is a T-shirt. When I gave a talk there a couple of years ago, they gave me this T-shirt. I gave that to my son, who's an MIT graduate. It says, MIT says, because not everyone can go to Caltech. But this is an MIT thing, a joint program for climate change. What they did was put together a model, said, okay, let me put economics, environment, everything in, right? And what it means, by that time, you don't understand any of it, but what they ended up with is saying, hey, if we're going to meet this goal, okay, and if we have a carbon tax and we have a reasonable name for $4,000 per kilowatt price for building nuclear, by God, nuclear really will solve that problem by putting it, by the year, but it takes a lot of nuclear power to be able to basically do that. It seems like a lot, though. In fact, back in 1985, we installed 30 gigawatts. So it's not by any means out of the question. I don't understand those models. All I'm saying is that you can get some models that the people who do models believe more or less in that this is it. Okay, so let's get back to the hard part, which is the dilemma. And that goes back to the NPT, nuclear weapons proliferation, peaceful nuclear. Those are the three things that one deals with this. Weapon states say they're going to reduce to zero. Non-weapon states say they're never going to build it. Proliferation, both say, well, no, we're not going to proliferate. But the key on this that people tend to forget sometimes is that the weapon states promise to help, the non-weapon states in build up. And you can argue whether they did or not. But that in fact was the Atoms for Peace idea. Again, that's the IAE and all the things that and Bruce is going to tell me how Livermore is really essential to all of this. But that's where Atoms for Peace is. So the speech really did some particular. But then how do you solve a nuclear dilemma? And that's where this whole idea of fuel cycle states or something like them, they make the fuel, right? They provide other states the reactors. They take back the fuel. They can indeed sell them the reactors, or it could be some sort of an international fuel bank. This was tried, or something like it, in the agreed framework, between North and Korea and South Korea and the U.S. That's what the global nuclear energy program was all about. Any of you, Bob? Some of you worked on that. I was dragged back into DOE to basically do that. Both of those failed. Okay, but it's now an integral part of the Iran deal, the JCPOA, and that's this was it here back in 1950. And I did not participate in that, but when it went up to the Hill and whatever, Ernie asked me to put together a research program that says, what should the labs be doing to ensure that it makes some sense? And this is a paper that he wrote about this. It's got all of these. Participants. One of it, of course, is spent fuel from power reactors removed. It happens to be going to Russia. Okay, but nonetheless, the pieces are basically all there. But he really, and if you, again, want to read this paper and discuss it with him, and we did, it really was absolutely essential that the laboratories had that support. He was able to reach back, forget the bureaucracy, he was able to reach back and pull all this together. And again, the last thing I did before I left was put together, if you will, a multi-lab group on where that might be. Interestingly, the counterpart was, of course, interesting enough, Ed Watkins, who was in fact Admiral Watkins, Jim Watkins' son, who has a PhD in nuclear engineering from Berkeley. Okay, and he was the one who also told me that the story about the Catholic bishops and his father's friendship with Cardinal OConnor was in fact real. And one of Ed's sisters is actually a nun, and when she became a nun, I don't know what the ceremony is. It's probably something like the Foster ceremony tomorrow. It was Cardinal OConnor who did the blessings and all the things that go with that. Again, small, basically small. Okay, now this is the story that I've been now, I think, been more or less paying for really back working with George and Choi and Tom Isaacs, but the long-term sustainment of really will require U.S. civilian nuclear power enterprise, both the JCPOA. So keeping nuclear power is a national security item, a very important national security item, as well as climate change. The two go together, and in fact, the numbers are not that different. If you're going to use climate, and you need a lot of nuclear power, if you're going to say, hey, I'm going to keep the U.S. in the nuclear power business because it's a national security issue, I'm really going to need a lot of it. Now, the future, now this is the, who was asking me, Holzer, is this going to be a depressing talk or an optimistic talk? This is the talk that's sort of in principle optimistic, in fact, depressing. So this is a curve that comes out of the Energy Information Agency. That's a DOD operation. They say, hey, boy, over time, China's really going ahead and going to be growing in this. But the United States is going to stay about the same. There's India growing and Russia's the same. However, if you look, our friends at Oak Ridge did this in detail, where the U.S. nuclear power industry actually is, there's nobody building them at all. And this is where we're going to be at. This is where we're going to go out. So this is, you take that to be, this curve, and here saying, whoops, we're getting out of that business. That says, hey, in another few years, we're going to be getting out of that business big time. And I would claim that this is, hey, this is not only a loss of our primary carbon-free electricity. Remember, our nuclear gives you 60% of the carbon-free electricity in this country. But it's also our influence in the non-proliferation regime. I mean, any hope of doing some of these things really is very, very difficult. And the sort of the data point on that is what we did for the Iran deal. If we didn't have all these people in the labs and underneath that, we would not have been able to do that. There is one hope left, I think, and that is a reactor program that the DOE is doing called that NewScale Power. This is also an example of a fellow named Jose Reyes, not the baseball player. Okay, he graduated, Maryland, got a PhD, something, went to work for NRC, and just got in his head, hey, how could I build a really super safe reactor, that nobody could. And he said, maybe I can use just natural convection, no pumps at all. And he designed a system that was relevant, it's 50 megawatts, and it actually works. Then the Navy actually has built something like this previous to that, so it works. The idea, but he's using commercial fuel, no super advantages, built in a factory, modular, and it, by and large, all the pieces get made in this country. The key is it's scalable to the demand. So if you can crank them out, it's scalable. Remember what I said, that this is a scale problem. On one nuclear power plant, no matter how good, isn't going to make terribly much difference. You're going to need a lot of them. Okay. And we've not been very, very good at doing this. There's a current program where they're cost sharing up to licensing with DOE, but the other part of this is the private sector who's doing the other part of the trade. How much longer can they continue to pay, if you will, to basically do this? NewScale has been, the Chinese have offered to buy NewScale, and the NewScale management has said no, but sooner or later you're going to get an activist shareholder or somebody coming in and saying, hey, we can't, they're going to offer us $500 million. How could we possibly turn that down? Well, so what it amounts to is that, hey, you're going to need some sort of a subsidy from the U.S. government. And that's either a carbon tax, you can bet, on how, or some idea that says this is a national security issue. If you put the numbers into it and you say this is a national security problem, it's peanuts. If you give it to, you know, nuclear energy in the DOE, oh my God, that's going to be half our budget. Yes, right, that's right. Okay, so let me get back to, then this is where I essentially finished. I'm looking at the time here, about 45 minutes, that's about right. Is zero nuclear weapons a useful goal, and so forth. These were my, and you look at it. When I look at it that way, I'm saying, hey, is that a useful goal? I'm saying really it isn't for now. Okay, I mean, you know, I'm not knowing about 20 years from now, but, you know, it's just the wrong sort of goal to be having. You're still going to need deterrence, Russia, China, and so forth. The problem is you need a lot, if you will, nuclear power necessary. I says, yes, there's no other way of doing this, if you believe. But you need a lot. But the way to do this, if you will, because of the dilemma, is fuel leasing. And I think enforceable international arrangements are indeed possible. But in fact, it's essential. You have to be able to verify. And interesting enough, when I looked at the JCPOA R&D, there's just a lot of good things waiting to happen. In one example, you know, artificial intelligence in terms of data could make a big difference in how I think about that. And we now have the computers, as you know, to basically do that. Of course, it's Google, you know, and Amazon and Facebook who are sort of working on these things. It has not really flowed back into this area. And the United States, I'm saying, still has the pieces in terms of across the board. That was Eisenhower's, including, and I said, you know, including civilian nuclear power. If we don't do it, I won't say China will, but some combination of China, Russia, or something like that will basically have any of that. Looking at the whole thing, I'm saying nothing I talked about is not kept technically available. I really tried to shy away from super types of nuclear, you know, nuclear power devices or new special super duper nuclear weapons. We got a really good stockpile. We know it's going to work. We have the technology to move in terms of nuclear power. The pieces are there, but boy, is this hard to do politically. And part of it is that, you know, there's not just a political divide of people like nuclear power don't necessarily big supporters of climate change mitigation and basically so forth. I mean, the real problem is, that, you know, where is diminishing and that sort of thing. This was at Caltech, and this was actually pointed out. This is a speech that Feynman gave. That's his so-called cargo cult speech to Caltech graduates. So every opportunity I do that. And what that says is, when you're dealing with science, there's a scientific integrity that you have to have. I mean, that's what science-based stockpile stewardship, that's what I meant by science-based. It's the science integrity that scientists have this sort of greater goal. I mean, they just want to make sure the science is right. And if you want to make sure it's right, you got to continually ask yourself, well, what's the other side? I mean, you don't need a red team, blue team to figure that out. That's ingrained in the way you're thinking about it. So again, this was a room filled with young scientists, you know, for the most part. I wanted to flow back into them. That sits right in there, you know, right in their wheelhouse. This is what Feynman said, and that's really very important. If you look carefully, I put down here, this is their motto. All right, I'm not much on mottos, but it said, you know, the truth shall make you free. A little not politically correct maybe, but in fact that's built into their motto, and I wanted them to, you know, leave with that particular statement. I have a few more backups, but we can maybe go to questions, and then we can take it from there. Thanks very much.